Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us today for this property webinar that we're running. For those of you that don't know me already, my name is Jason Condie, and I am an accounts advisory partner from DAINS Accountants. I personally specialise in medical practice, finance, and at last count, I think I look after about 97 practices across Scotland. Today, I've got Will Ellis of BW Healthcare Surveyors joining me. Will's going to do his own introduction in a minute. But over the last few years, we've worked pretty closely together on a number of cases across various property matters. And today, Will is going to present what they've been getting involved in recently. And hopefully, there'll be something in this for everybody, whether you're a property owning practice or whether you're leasing from the health board or a third-party landlord. We've got plenty of time. We've got an hour set aside for this, and I think Will's expecting his presentation to take 25 minutes, half an hour. So there should be plenty of time for questions at the end. But if you think of something and you want to put it into the Q&A section of Teams, we'll come back to it and we'll pick them up at the end, just so we're not kind of disrupting Will's presentation. Anyway, I think that's probably enough from me. So over to you, Will.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Jason. So yeah, as Jason said, I just thought it'd be useful for me to come and have a bit of a conversation about what we're seeing in Scotland when it comes to premises from an owner-occupied kind of perspective, but then also a leasehold perspective. So the presentation's kind of split in half, really. The first half being relevant to those in owner-occupied practices, and the second half being relevant to those in leasehold practices, or perhaps those wanting to become a leasehold entity. So the first bit, I'll just explain who I am and who the company are very briefly. Then we'll be talking about those practices in owner-occupied premises, so all to do with notional rent. And then for those in leasehold premises, we'll be talking about different things, different aspects to think about when you're leasing your premises, how to maximise your rental income. Sorry, someone's just said in the chat, Jason, that they can't hear. Is that just them specifically? I presume you can hear okay.
Sorry, I was just unmuting myself. I can hear you fine.
Fine. That's fine. Maybe
if anybody else is having any issues, though, please let me know.
Fine. Right. I will crack on, assuming everyone can hear me okay. Right. Okay. Perfect. So we'll talk very briefly then about how to maximize your rental income, some things to think about in terms of increasing your rental income, increasing the value of the premises as well. And then we'll just end the presentation with a few bits and bobs that we can assist you with as a company. We actually offer a free premises health check to all practices in the UK. So I'll just briefly mention that and what is involved in that side of things. So okay, so in terms of who I am, so my name is Will Ellis. I'm the managing director actually here at BW Healthcare Surveyors. So we set up this company around 9 years ago. Me and a couple of my ex-colleagues, and we basically help practices with a wide variety of different things, predominantly rent reviews and notional rent reviews. So making sure that the rent you receive from the NHS is correct in line with the current market. We assist with lease rent reviews. So if your landlord instigates a rent review, we can assist you through that process or through the lease renewal process, market valuation, sale and leasebacks, anything to do with premises related matters, basically. So we've already assisted around 2,000 practices since the company was launched in 2017. That is UK wide. It's probably maybe around 100, I would have thought, in Scotland, if not a little bit more. We are #1 ranked specialist primary care surveying firm on Practice Index with nearly 200 5-star reviews. And we've actually got 8 specialist surveyors here as well. So it's not just, I mean, I'm not a surveyor myself. So there's 8 other surveyors who, and all we do on a day-to-day basis is assist practices with premises related matters. We only deal with primary care, with GP practices. So we would like to know, we know a little bit about premises in primary care. So that was just to qualify that we know what we're talking about more than anything else. Okay, so in terms of the presentation, so the first thing I wanted to talk about was notional rent reviews. So those of you who are in owner occupied premises will be fully aware of your notional rent reviews. They take place every 3 years. It is undertaken by the health boards. So the health boards will arrange for their district valuers to come and give you their opinion of what the notional rent should be for the next 3 years. It's a very strange concept, really, when you think about it, because in most commercial with most commercial rent reviews, it's the landlord that determines what the rent is, what the rent the tenant should pay. But actually, in primary care, it's the reverse of that. So actually, technically, the NHS are the tenants. They are the tenants, and you as GPs are the landlords of the premises. So it's actually the tenants telling the landlords how much they're going to be paying, which is a little bit backwards. I mean, from our point of view, we probably deal with about 400 rent reviews a year. And around 89% of practices that we visit are underfunded. So the district valuers are keeping rents as low as possible. I don't know if it's a deliberate thing or just their personal opinions, but it is so vital, I think, that you get a second opinion when you receive those notional rent assessments, just to make sure that what the landlord is proposing is correct in line with current market. Make sure they've measured the surgery correctly, make sure they've counted the right number of car parking spaces, and making sure that they are keeping the rents in line with the current market, because as those statistics suggest, they quite often are not. Like I said, the reviews are done every 3 years, or at least the reviews should be done every 3 years. For anyone who's in an owner-occupied practice and has gone through a rent review, you will be fully aware that they very rarely undertaken on time. I think in Scotland, they're perhaps 12, 18 months overdue in most health board areas. So it's so important that you kind of regularly chase that, just to ensure that your rent stays in line with the current market and you're not missing out on financial income. So the biggest thing I would suggest is just to keep on top of your rent reviews. Be aware of when they are. Chase the health boards for the Prem 1 forms and the district valuer visit and the district valuer's report, just to try and speed that process up, because leaving it up to them could delay things significantly. It is also, I mean, when they send through the Prem 1 forms, I mean, the Prem 1 forms are relatively simple to fill in, but when they send them through, they always send blank forms through, but on the assumption that very little has ever changed at the practice, you can just get hold of the previously submitted forms and just resubmit them. It's very, very easy to do. They're exactly the same format. They have been the same format for 10, 15 years. So if you've got a copy of the previously submitted forms, rather than waiting for the health board to instigate that by sending you fresh ones, if you know you're due a review, you can just get hold of the previous ones that you've submitted and just resubmit them to the health board, just to save a little bit of time.
Well, can I just ask you, where the district valuer review is late, when they eventually get round to it, they will backdate any notional rent increase to when it should have kicked in. Am I right?
That is absolutely right. Yeah. No, that's absolutely right, Jason. Yeah. So however long it takes,
you won't lose any income. It's just
they won't lose any income in the long term. But I guess from a cash flow perspective is what I meant, really.
And also, I guess if you've got partnership changes, you've got partners leaving, and they should have had a chunk of this backdated rent, that can make it a bit tricky to make sure that each partner's getting their fair share of the rental income.
Yeah, and that's a really vital point as well, actually, Jason, because another thing to consider in that circumstance is if you've got a partnership leaving, when it comes to valuing the premises, the value of the premises is actually quite closely aligned to the rental income. So if actually that rent review hasn't taken place, then perhaps even the value of the premises might be slightly less than it should be as well. So yeah, if there's a partnership change going on, then I think it's vitally important that rent review is taken place, perhaps even before any valuations are undertaken, if possible. So yeah, very good point. As I mentioned, never just accept the district valuer's proposal. So I think it's so important to get a second opinion, and that doesn't mean you always have to appeal it. You know, it might be a case that you get a second opinion and what the district valuer has been proposed is correct in line with the current market, and then you don't need to appeal. You don't need to go through the process of instigating an appeal and going through those negotiations. But I think it's very, very important to just get a second opinion. There's so many companies out there who can offer that second opinion. From our point of view, we can do a free initial assessment for you. So it's not even going to cost you any money for us to give you that free initial advice. And our fees are performance related. So you'd only pay as if we get you an increase. So you have very little to lose in terms of just getting that second opinion to make sure what the district valuer has proposed is correct and in line with the current market. One of the biggest things we see is notional rent abatements as well. So if you've ever had an extension on the premises, you you've perhaps received grant money for that extension from the health board. What they'll do is, because they've potentially paid towards that extension, they're not then going to give you full rent for that part of the building. So if you've got an extension, let's say you received £100,000 grant, or let's say you received for easier math, let's say you received a £60,000 grant and you funded £40,000 of it. So it's a 60-40 split effectively. What happens is, if that extension is worth an extra £10,000 in notional rent, they're not going to give you that full £10,000. They're only going to give you that percentage that you contributed to, that 40% that you contributed towards it. The other 60% will be reduced for a period of time. That might be 5, 10, 15 years, and that'll be in the abatement and the funding agreement arranged at the time. What a lot of practices aren't aware of is you get the percentage that you funded, so that 40%, that £40,000 that you funded, but you get 10% on top of that. So if you've funded 40%, you should actually receive 50% of the rent. If you funded 60%, you should actually receive 70%. So you get your percentage funding plus 10%, and that is often missed in notional rent assessments. So again, just checking your notional rent calculations can be a very easy win for you without even having to instruct a surveyor, just understanding what those notional rent calculations are. And then with regards, if you are to build extensions and have improvements, and I'd say specifically for extensions, it's so important that when you're thinking about new developments and extensions, that you seek approval from the health board for reimbursement. So you'll have to get approval to build, so you can use it for GMS purposes, but then also you'll have to have approval for the actual reimbursement of that extension as well. We've had far too many examples of practices who have built an extension assuming they're automatically going to get reimbursement, and that is not the case. And then trying to get retrospective in reimbursement can be very, very difficult. So just very important, if you're planning any changes or upgrades or improvements to the surgery, that you keep the health board involved throughout the whole process, including any potential rent reviews that you might have or rent reimbursement schemes that you might want to apply for. Okay, so again, that was obviously to do with notional rents. Sticking with owner-occupied premises just for a little bit longer, and in terms of maximising the value of the premises, there are plenty of things you can do to increase the value of the premises. The main way to do that is by increasing the rental income. So the rental income, as I've just mentioned, has a very significant impact on the value of the premises, and actually increasing your rental income, not necessarily just through notional rent, but through any rents, increasing it by £1,000 a year can have significant impacts on the capital value, maybe 10, 15 times that amount when it comes to capital value. So if you increase it by £1,000 a year in rent, it can increase the value by £10,000-15,000 potentially. And there's quite a few ways to look at maximising that rental income. The best way, without hammering it home too much, is by checking the notional rent is correct. That is the biggest way. That's your biggest rental income, I presume, for 99% of practices. Their biggest rental income, it comes via the notional rent scheme. So that's the best way of increasing it, just making sure that what's being proposed is correct and in line with the current market. But other ways, perhaps you've got space in the premises that's rented out to pharmacies or dentists or alternative providers, whatever it may be. If you're renting space out to somebody else and you're not receiving notional rent for that space, it's just making sure that that space is actually, those tenants are tied down to leases, ideally long-term leases if at all possible. Again, another major factor when it comes to valuing premises isn't just the rental income, but it's the length of lease that are assigned to tenancies within that building. So if you've got a couple of rooms rented out to a dentist, but that's only on a month-by-month rolling contract, that's not going to have a significant impact on the value of the premises as much as if they were tied down to a 15-year lease. Because if you see it from an investor's point of view, that rent isn't as guaranteed when it's only on a rolling contract as it is when it's on a long-term contract. So if you are renting space out to, if you're tenants in the building, you're renting space out to pharmacies, whoever it may be, just make sure that you've got those agreements in place, those leases in place, and try and tie them down to as longer term leasing possible. And if you already have leases in place with them, make sure there's rent review provisions within the lease that enables you to have periodic rent reviews, whether that's every 12 months or every 3 years. Just making sure that the rents you're receiving from those tenants are increased in line with the market on regular basis. Make sure you're instigating those rent reviews as well. And then if you've got any spare space in the premises, which I don't think anybody's got any spare space, but if you manage to magic some spare space from somewhere, perhaps you used to rent space out to a tenant, but they've now left and that space is now just unoccupied, you could perhaps look at bringing in another tenant, or if not, looking at if you can start using that for NHS purposes and and apply to the health board for reimbursement of that space as well, just to maximise the entire part of the building.
I guess, well, thinking about some of the practices that I've been out to visit,
yeah,
you know, quite often you'll have quite a splendid, quite a grand waiting room area, which with you know, it doesn't feel like they're fully being utilized, those waiting room spaces, and so you could maybe carve that into more clinical rooms and, you know, arguably create more space for to see more patients, or to lease to other you know, to other third-party professionals,
yeah, I
healthcare
mean,
professionals.
I mean, that's certainly an option. I mean, what I will say is that's probably not going to have a huge effect on the actual rental income, because what you'll find is the premises will be assigned a unit rate, so a cost per square meter, and it doesn't necessarily matter what that meterage is used for, whether that's waiting space, admin space, clinical space. It wouldn't make a huge, it wouldn't increase the notional rent a huge amount by taking that space away from being a waiting space rather than clinical space, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So I guess it's probably understanding how much of the building is actually been approved for reimbursement, and a lot of practices don't even know that, and a lot of practices aren't aware. A lot of practices just assume that they're getting reimbursement for their entire building, and that is not always the case. I mean, this is an example down in England, but this only happened a couple of weeks ago. We went out to a client who had three floors, so they had a ground floor, a first floor, and a second floor. They were using it all for GMS space. And they realized that they were only getting reimbursed for 2 floors, and that had been happening for nearly 10 years, but they just never realized that they weren't getting reimbursed, and that was just an error. That was an error made by the ICBs down here, but it just gives you an example of how these things can happen, and similar errors can be made up here in Scotland as well. So it's just making sure and understanding. And the problem is, and again, the differences between England and Scotland. So down here in England, when practices receive their notional rent assessments, the district value actually breaks down how that notional rent assessment has been arrived at. So it'll actually say how much what their reimbursement is, what their unit rate is, so how much they're getting paid per square meter, and then it'll also say what the size of the surgery is, so how many square meters of reimbursement they're receiving for the first floor and the ground floor and the second floor. Whereas up in Scotland, that's not the case at all. All they give you, as anybody will know who's ever received a notional rent assessment, is just the figure. It doesn't tell you how that is arrived at. It doesn't tell you how they've calculated that. So it can be very difficult actually for practices to do that, to do those checks. But
and that figure should always, well, from my knowledge, should always either stay the same or go up. It shouldn't, in theory, ever go down, that notional rent figure.
Yeah, I mean, and that's right. Yeah, and your experience is absolutely right, Jason. I mean, it technically can. It's technically based on a current market rent, and markets can go up and down. But I have the same experience as you, Jason. I've been doing this for 15 years, and rents have never gone down. The market has never gone down. So yeah, it should always either stay the same or go up. I have seen rents go down. So I could give you a number of examples where rents go down, but that tends to be because errors have been made. So perhaps they've measured the surgery too big, which can always happen. Yes, sometimes they measure surgeries too small, but they can measure them too big as well, and perhaps have just over rented places. Or sometimes when practices build extensions, they double count extensions, or they maybe counted the number of car parking spaces wrong. So rents can go down, but when they go down, it's because of factual errors rather than the market itself going down. So yeah, the market is effectively on an upward spiral, and has been for as long as I've been doing this for sure. So yeah, so I mean, upgrade. The last thing is upgrading and improving surgeries. So obviously, a very good way of increasing the rental income is by upgrading and improving the surgery. If you're modernising the surgery or you're making it bigger, then that's going to increase the value of the value of the premises as well, and increase the rental income, as long as you get those necessary approvals from the health board to ensure that they are agreeing to reimburse you. Okay, so that's it from an owner-occupied premises, owner-occupied side of things. Just a slide to do for those of your clients kind of joining us in leasehold premises. So if you are either putting a lease in place or you already have a lease in place, just a few health warnings to consider, or things to check perhaps within the lease to make sure that you already have these protections and clauses in place.
It certainly feels, well, like there's a lot of leases coming to an end right now, like a lot of 25-year leases must have been done around the same time, and there's a lot of practices, certainly feels that way, are coming to the end of their leases in the next year or two.
Yeah, and lease renewals is something we're definitely gonna cover, Jason, because that is really important that practices get representation, I think, when it comes to lease renewals, just to make sure that they've got certain protections in there, because we see a number of leases, and this is especially what it says here, that to make sure that it's a specific NHS GP surgery lease. There's so many leases that aren't specific to the NHS, aren't specific to primary care, and it's a very unique sector, really, because in most sectors you've got a landlord and you've got a tenant, and it's a very simple relationship between the landlord and tenant. In primary care, you've got a third entity, really, the NHS themselves, so the health boards in Scotland, and the health boards are going to have very key involvement in particular parts of the lease, specifically the rent reviews, specifically the lease renewals as well. So the lease renewals are going to have to get approved by the health board, and if that's not actually stipulated within the lease, practices run the risk of actually having to pay the landlord more than what they're getting reimbursed. So it's so important that those leases are specific NHS GP surgery lease. Make sure that it stipulates what the health board's role is in those key lease events. When they're going through the renewal process, or when they're putting a lease in place, so important that those leases are approved and ratified by the health board, by the NHS, because effectively the NHS are agreeing to pay to reimburse that rent for the duration of the lease. So they need to go through their own due diligence to make sure that it's value for money from their point of view, to actually pay for that. And especially if it's a 25-year lease, as you've mentioned, Jason, that is a long-term lease. That is quite a commitment from the health board to agree to pay that rent for that period of time. And they may not be happy with that length of lease. They may want a shorter lease this time round. So yeah, very, very important that those leases are approved, and before they are formally signed as well. So what you should do, you should draft the heads of terms for the renewal. Let's just talk about renewals, as that seems to be a big issue at the moment. So when the landlord instigates a renewal and proposes heads of terms, you'll have the opportunity to negotiate those heads of terms. You're not obligated to agree the identical terms, because there may be specific things within the lease, which I'll get to in a moment or two, that aren't relevant at renewal that they were when the building was built 25 years ago. So it's very, very important that practices just review those heads of terms that come through from the landlord, make sure they're happy with them. If they're not, negotiate changes to them, and then before that lease is put in place, that those heads of terms are then sent to the NHS, to the health board, to get the necessary approval, so they can obviously do their bit and make sure that they've got their own protections. One of the biggest things I think practices should check within their leases to make sure that they've got rent review protections. So again, we see so many practices who don't have rent review protections. And when I say rent review protections, there should be a clause in every lease, in every NHS GP surgery lease, that says something along the lines of: the rent that the tenants pay the landlord cannot exceed what they get reimbursed by the NHS. So what that means is, when the landlord instigates a rent review and proposes an increase, that increase is only going to be paid if the health board agree to reimburse the practice up to that level. Now, if the health board say we're not happy with that increase, we think it should be a 5% increase rather than a 10% increase, then the practice don't have to pay the landlord anything more than what is agreed with the district valuer. Now, the landlords have the opportunity, just like the owner-occupied practices do. The landlords will have an opportunity to appeal that with the district valuer if they wish. That's a negotiation and a discussion between the landlord and and the health board. But from a tenant perspective, as long as you've got those protections that say the rent can't exceed what you're getting paid, then you should be absolutely fine. Something else to check as well is check your obligations and the retention of rent. So your repair and maintenance obligations, you've got two things. You can either be just responsible for the internal repair and maintenance, or you can be responsible for the internal and the external repair and maintenance. Now, the external repair should technically be the landlord's responsibility. A lot of landlords don't want that responsibility, which is nice of them. So they tend to bat it back to the tenants, and they say, look, you take on the responsibility of the external repair and maintenance, but you can retain a proportion of the rent that you receive from the NHS. And that retention can be, normally, I'd say 9 times out of 10, somewhere between 5 and 10%. The higher it is, the higher the percentage, the better. Because what it means is, let's say it's 10%, the NHS pay you £100,000 a year. You can withdraw or retain 10% of that, and you can just put that into a sinking fund and use that for any repairs and maintenance that's needed for the external part of the building. Now, when it comes to the lease renewals that are coming up, Jason, this is a vital point, I think, because let's say these buildings were built 25 years ago and they signed 25-year leases. These were brand new buildings 25 years ago. So a 5% retention of rent would be more than acceptable. Now, 25 years on, when it comes to renewal, the landlords are going to try to suggest that a 5%, that 5% has just remained at that level. But actually, these buildings are 25 years older than they were previously. So actually, that retention of rent should be a lot higher because the cost of maintaining them is more. And that's the idea of this retention is practices shouldn't be making money from the retention, but it also shouldn't be costing them money either. You're taking on what should be the landlord's responsibility. The landlord's saying, I don't want that responsibility, but you shouldn't be financially penalized for that. So it should, and it doesn't always, and you can't guarantee it does, but you should be taking a relevant percentage to ensure that it gives you the best chance of not having to dip into your own pockets for the repairs and maintenance. And it can be negotiated even higher. I mean, we negotiated, I think towards the end of last year, there was a practice in Edinburgh, and we negotiated a retention of 15% because the building was nearly falling apart. So, you know, these things can be negotiated. So just because the landlord is proposing, let's say, a 5% retention, that's something that I would certainly be looking at, arguing and trying to negotiate a higher retention, so it's not costing you, you know, tens, hundreds of thousands of pounds sometimes to keep the building in a good state of repair for what should be the landlord's responsibility. So certainly check what your rent review protections are. Make sure you've got the necessary rent review protections. Make sure or check what your obligations are when it comes to your repair.
Just before you move on, Will, I'm not sure if you're going to come on to it, but dilapidations are still a really sort of hot potato right now, I would say, with these leases coming to an end and, you know, crazy dilapidations liabilities being thrown around by landlords. Have you got any input on that? Any feedback on what practices can do to, I mean, obviously get the lawyers involved, and that usually brings the delapse liabilities right down. But anything from your surveyor point of view?
I mean, we don't get
delapse report, I suppose. Is that something you guys do as well?
I was going to say that. I mean, we don't get directly involved in that, to be honest with you, Jason. So we obviously assist a lot of practice with lease renewals. And when it comes to dilapidation reports or schedule of conditions, it's a slightly different surveying matter. So practices would need building surveyors. But it's absolutely, if they're having charges for dilapidations that are astronomical, which they always are. But to be honest with you, again, from a landlord's perspective, it tends to be a negotiation. They send through these really scary charges, knowing full well that the practices aren't going to agree to them, so they can just negotiate things down. So that's all it is. It's a negotiation. So I would tell practices
opening gambit,
yeah, just not to be overly concerned with those initial dilapidations. I mean, we had one 6 months ago that was nearly £1 million. You know, so they're ridiculous.
Yeah, that wins. I can't beat that, Will.
Yeah. I mean, they are ridiculous. But from a landlord's perspective, you might as well try it on if you can. But I think these things can just be negotiated. So it's understanding what your repair and maintenance obligations are, first of all. So what the dilapidation costs that the landlords put forward, are they even your responsibility? Is that in the lease? Are the things that they're suggesting you should do even your responsibility. So checking the lease to find out what your repair and maintenance obligations are, definitely having a schedule of condition. I mean, I think it depends on what the level of the charges are. I would certainly just try and negotiate them down without even spending any money on a building surveyor for a schedule of condition. If you can negotiate them down to a level that you're happy with, then fine. Don't waste your money on a schedule of condition. But if you reach a bit of an impasse in those negotiations and those discussions, then yes, get a schedule of condition, get a dilapidation report, find out what the cost should have been, and then take it from there. But it's just a negotiation. That's all it is. Okay. So the next thing is to do with the service level agreements. Again, so I know you mentioned.
Yeah, very hot potato, especially in Lothian right now.
Is it specifically? Yeah, because I mean, I know a lot of health boards have kind of significantly increased the costs, haven't they?
Well, NHS Lothian has been quite aggressive, I would say, in terms of the SLAs. And I feel like this is almost a test case for the other health boards, that they're going to see how NHS Lothian gets on with these demands. And then if they're successful, then you'll have all the regions probably going at it. But yeah, NHS Lothian, and there's a collection of practices that are opposing NHS Lothian, are fighting the case basically right now. So yeah, you can see there's comments in the meeting chat, which we will come back to at the end, talking about SLAs, because it is very topical right now.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, again, it's probably more of a legal matter than a surveying one, but we do get involved in it in a roundabout kind of way. I don't know if there's a huge amount practices it can do with the increases. I mean, I think it's probably checking the agreements to see how the agreements have been worded, to see what whether the health boards can even increase them to those levels. So I think it's probably just getting legal advice to have a look at those agreements. I think the most important thing is if practices are receiving a service level agreement, they don't just sign it without getting that advice. I think it's just important to get the advice, to make sure that practices are aware of what they're actually signing up to, and just seek professional advice. But it's mainly solicitors really, that it's because it's a contractual dispute effectively.
Yeah. But the issue I think is that it's not just forward looking, it's also sort of retrospective SLAs that were
going back.
They're going back a few years, and as well as here's these high charges going forward too. So yeah, I think you're right. I think it's a sort of specialist lawyer point of view, because it's contractual.
It is, and that's the thing. It's just to check to see what they're exactly understanding the terms of the agreement, and whether they can increase them by such significant levels. And then again, it's just a discussion and a negotiation really, with the individual health boards, I think. Okay, the last thing to consider is potentially lease re-gears. So before we go into our free premises health check, I know presentation has probably taken slightly longer than I promised.
That's my fault. That's my fault.
But the last point is just with regards to lease re-gears. So I know there's, by the sounds of it, Jason, there's a lot of practices who are due renewals, which is fine. So that's just a standard renewal process. Now, a lease re-gear is actually renewing the lease early. And it's really relevant to practices who are perhaps 4, 5, 6 years away from lease renewal of maybe a 25-year lease. Now, the benefits to the practices is if you are in a position where you're 5 years away from renewal, you're actually in quite a good negotiation period to be able to go to the landlord and negotiate perhaps an early renewal and ask the landlord if you sign up to a lease early, would they consider building you an extension, or would they consider upgrades and improvements to the surgery? So it's quite a good period. That 4, 5, 6 years before renewal is a really good period for tenants to approach landlords to try and renew early. Now, from a landlord's perspective, the reason why they would consider that is because the difference in value between a building with a 5-year lease and a building with a 25-year lease can be significant, hundreds of thousands of pounds, if not, $1 million. So it depending on the size of it. So landlords would be certainly open to have discussions, or certain landlords would be open to have discussions about renewing early, increasing the value of the premises in return for building an extension or upgrades and improvements. Now, the landlords aren't obligated to do this; they don't have to, but it's just potentially worthwhile opening those discussions to see if that is a possibility. So if you're in a practice that is 4, 5, 6 years away from expiry, and you're in need of upgrades, in need of improvements, but you're struggling to fund those yourselves or can't get any grant money from the health board, then perhaps approaching the landlord might be a solution if you are a few years from lease expiry. Okay, so that is it really. Just very, very briefly from what we've talked about. A few of the things that we do, and I've mentioned it already, we can actually check your notional rent assessments free of charge. So if you have recently had a district values report, feel free to send it through to us. We can check it, make sure it's correct, make sure you're not getting underfunded. And we can check your leases as well, actually. So if you've got a lease and you're not sure whether you've got rent protections in the lease, you're not sure what your repair and maintenance obligations are, or you're not sure when your lease expires or when your rent reviews are due, send it through to us. We can pass it on to one of our surveyors. We can do a free initial assessment to advise on all these aspects, and then perhaps put a plan in place on how we can assist you moving forward. And the same thing goes for any space you rent out to any tenants, so pharmacy leases or alternative therapy leases, whatever it may be. If you've got tenants in your premises and you've got leases assigned to them, again, we can check those leases, advise on when the rent reviews are due, advise on when the lease renewals are due. If it's a pharmacy lease, we can actually advise on the rents very, very easily. The rents for pharmacies are often attached to the patient list size. So it's just a cost per patient quite often when it comes to pharmacy rents. So it's very, very easy calculation to understand whether pharmacies are paying correct and in line with the current market. So again, notional rent reviews, surgery leases, pharmacy leases, any other leases really that are assigned to the premises, we can do those free initial assessments. We can have a free consultation call. So yeah, feel free to get in touch if you require any of that, any of those services. And final thoughts, I just think it's so important if you're going through anything with regard to your premises, just to get specialist advice, whether that's through accountants, through DAINS and Jason, or surveyors like ourselves, or specialist solicitors. There's so many specialists out there that are easily accessible. So just very, very important that you speak to specialists, and so important that they have specialist primary care experience, because it's such a niche sector that it's almost a minefield if you've never acted in the sector before. So yeah, just very, very important that you get specific advice. But yeah, I've seen questions pop through, so I'm not sure we'll have time to answer them all in 20 minutes, Jason, but we'll give it a go.
Should we carve it up into sort of property owning versus leased?
Fine.
So property owning, let's go back to the start. Linda is asking, would you having a lease in place with a tenant, say it's 15 years, be problematic if a decision was made to then sell the property from GP ownership? So you've got a lease in place with a tenant, but you actually want to sell the partner-owned property at a later date. Does it make it problematic or more attractive that there's already I guess it depends on the use, I suppose.
So do you mean a tenant, so like a pharmacy, for example, I presume she means?
Yeah,
I mean, it's neither here nor there is what I would say. I mean, as long as that tenant is signed up to a long-term lease, I think that's important. I would say if there's a tenant in place and the lease isn't at least, I would say minimum 5 years. If you can try and push it to 10, then even better. But no, from an investor's point of view, they'll just make allowances out for it when it comes to the value. That's all it is. It'll just be valued based on that rental income and based on the length of the lease. So it doesn't make a difference either way, to be honest with you. It's fine. And from an investor, all the investor really cares about is what their rental income is and how long that's guaranteed for. That's all they will be looking at, is the rental income and how long that's guaranteed for. So how long is the lease? So yeah, as long as there's a decent lease in place, I think it'll be fine.
And that would be okay if, say, you'd leased a room, to another healthcare professional or something like that, in like a physiotherapist or something that's not part of the NHS, and they still had a lease, but you wanted to sell the rest of the building around them and the use wasn't going to be a medical practice, that wouldn't, scupper the sale. Potentially, you would just break that lease.
Are they selling it as a non-GP surgery? So
it's hypothetical. This is all hypothetical.
If they're selling it as alternative use, no, that would cause an issue. Because if they're selling it as a GP surgery to an investor or to somebody else, it's fine, because it's a
sale and leaseback.
It's a medical premises. if they're selling it as alternative use, then they're going to have to apply for that alternative use. And if there's an existing tenant in there, then I would have thought that would complicate things, but it's probably more of a legal matter. But yeah, that would definitely complicate things, I would have thought.
Okay. Graham from one of my practices in Aberdeen, making the point about the sort of Aberdeen effect, you know, when the sort of North Sea oil, the value of property in Aberdeen went down, and
Yep.
he's saying that a number of practices have seen real term reductions in notional rent based on district value opinion, that CMR has decreased. So yeah, current market rate has decreased, and despite appealing, surveyors told not negotiable. Are you seeing that?
That is an anomaly, actually. That is an anomaly in Grampian, yeah, and in Aberdeen. We've had a couple of clients to that effect, to try and. I mean, I do think that on the majority of cases, the health boards, certainly on the ones that we've done, have tried to keep them static, or just done them on, value them on separate methodology. But yeah, like I said, it's a current market rent. That's the issue. So there's always that risk that something could implode, the market could implode, and they could go down. But yeah, there's not.
I guess in real terms, by with everything else going up, if you're keeping notional rent the same and you're not keeping pace with inflation, then in real terms you really are seeing a bit of a reduction in property profit, I suppose.
I mean, if we take inflation into account, then yeah, notional rents have been going down for 15 years.
I suppose. Yeah.
It's not in line. The notional rent increases aren't in line with inflation. They haven't been, unfortunately. It's a completely separate matter, because we get asked that all the time. But yeah, that's just. I mean, some. I say some, very, very few, and I don't know if there's any in Scotland. I'm not aware of any, but certainly in England, there's some rents that are attached to the RPI, which is near enough in line with inflation. It's just an RPI increase, which is obviously it's a completely different method of calculating the rent. But yeah, if it's on a current market rent, then it's exactly that.
And last sort of property owning question: what length of time is reasonable for the health board to respond to a rent review?
Good question. I don't know what time. I don't know. Is the simple answer to that. They do not respond quickly, though, and unfortunately there's nothing in any directions to suggest they have to respond in a particular amount of time. So it is, yeah, I mean, realistically they should do it within 6 months, I think, from review, but they don't. They can take 12, 18. I mean, we've done reviews that are 6 years overdue. And like you said at the start, Jason, because the rents are backdated, that's always their excuse. They go, well, it'll get backdated, so it's fine. It'll be sorted eventually. So yeah, there's no time limit on it. There's no time restraints from them. So it is just, that's why I said it's so important to just keep on top of them to try and speed that process up.
Okay. Leased premises, we got time? Yeah, we got time.
Yeah.
Right. What if a landlord adds on additional costs such as service charges throughout the year rather than increasing the rent? So you've got, landlord adding on extra costs. Again, well, I mean, that's referring back to the lease.
I was going to say it depends on what the lease is. That if the lease allows them to do that, then that's fine. It's just understanding the terms of the lease and what they're allowed to do. But again, it can be negotiated, so the service charges can be checked to make sure that what they're proposing is correct and in line with the current market, and they are increasing them in line with the market. So they are still open to negotiation, but that should all be stipulated in the lease. So yeah, it's just a case of checking the lease to make sure to see what that says, I think.
And I guess, if you're renewing it, making sure that it's reflects what you expect in the first instance. So when you refer back to it, it's as watertight as you can expect it to be.
I was going to say, yeah, just certainly at renewal, just making sure you've got all the necessary protections. And that, I mean, ultimately, that's the whole point of a lease. The whole point of a lease is to avoid disputes. Because the lease should be as clear as possible and cover every eventuality. So if the landlord's proposing something that's outside of the lease, then you don't have to pay it. But if it stipulates it in the lease that's the case, there's nothing you can do about it. So it's just, it's all about understanding what the lease is and what your responsibilities are.
Landlord advised external maintenance should be undertaken under our SLA contract and is therefore our responsibility together with health board tenants. So yeah, that sounds like an external maintenance as well as internal maintenance. But you said that that is just kind of prescribed by the lease again, what's been signed up to.
Again, yeah, it's just, I'm sorry to keep on saying this, but it's impossible to answer the questions without seeing the lease effectively. Yeah, it's all depend on what it stipulates in the lease. What I would say in both those circumstances, if those practices want to send us the lease, as I've said,
sounds like I think you're going to get a lot of leases coming your way.
Yeah, which is fine. I mean, I don't mind because I don't check them, but my surveyors might be moaning about it. But yeah, look, I'm fine with that. So yeah, just get them to send through the leases, and we can check to see what it stipulates in the lease.
Yeah, and another lease one. Can what's in SLA be negotiated? I think you said yes. It's like a starting point, isn't it? The draft we have is contradictory for one and has unsustainable liabilities. Is this likely a negotiation tactic?
Potentially, yeah. I mean, that is just that's how negotiations work. You just put absolutely everything in to start. Increase everything knowing full well that it's going to be negotiated down. So yeah,
with the most expensive supplier you can find.
Yeah, but I mean but that is a negotiation tactic potentially. So I mean, it might not be, and there might be reasonable charges, and it'd be hard for us to say without reviewing them. But it sounds to me like a negotiation tactic. Yeah.
Okay. I think that was everything there. But yeah, as Will says, if you have any notional rent reviews, lease reviews, take advantage of the free assessment while it's still free, because you're going to get bombarded, maybe, Will, with these.
Yeah, maybe I'll just say the first 5 are free.
Yeah.
I'm only joking. We do these all the time, and from our point of view, it's not much work. I mean, our surveyors check leases on a day-to-day basis, so it's it'll probably only take 10 minutes, so it's no issue at all.
Excellent. And I should have said at the start, this webinar is recorded, and so we will be circulating the link around all of our practice. If you weren't able to make it, or you had partners or practice managers who wanted to come along that couldn't make it, then we will be sharing the recording link a bit later on. Anything else, Will, you wanted to add?
I don't think so. No. I mean, if my contact details are shared, then yeah, more than happy for anyone who perhaps didn't have time to ask a question or didn't want to ask a question in front of everyone and wants to just contact me individually, then yeah, more than happy to have individual chats as well. If anybody wants to give me a call, drop me an email, we can set up Teams meetings or set up calls. More than happy to have those discussions if and when required. But no, look, from my point of view, I really appreciate you letting us come on and talk to everyone, Jason. So it's been yeah, I've really enjoyed it. So thank you.